I know a pilgrimage now when I see one. And after the Iritanis and the Hanzliks told me about I don't know that I'd call it a vacation, but their trip to the Deep South specifically to explore the history of the civil rights movement, I said, you must share. Please share. Please share with us.
You all get ready for our vacation slideshow. You're going to be here a while. No, that's not entirely true. A few things about how our trip came together and some of the context. Let's wait for Grace for a second there. There we go. Somewhere between the deep dive that Mary Lou was taking into civil rights study and Natchez Trail bike trip that Ken and Lesley were planning, we realized we could marry the two together in a week-long trip. We'd be touring the Deep South together. These are cotton rolls, if you don't recognize what those are. An area of the country that many of us would likely not put on our top 10 list of vacation sites. Ken and Lesley planned and booked the accommodations, restaurants and destinations without any need of a green book, mind you. Clarence knows what I'm talking about. And Mary Lou added a must-see list of civil rights museums and historical sites. My assignment was to incorporate a few music sidebars into the tour. Together, we hoped to gather perspective on the history of human relations in this area and enjoy some southern fried food and entertainment along the way. Oops, skipped one there, Muscle Shoals. We began our journey in Memphis. We took both civil rights and music sites in, and then side trips to Clarksdale and Muscle Shoals, and resumed our civil rights journey through Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, and ultimately Jackson. For me, every day was a teachable moment. To learn about the lives of the many brave and vigilant people through the lens of a particular time and place was a powerful experience. Some of it was unpleasant, yet in the end, inspiring. It makes you want to discover more. It makes you want to do more. And now our journey begins in Memphis.
Right now, we find our country very divided. This vacation to the Deep South was to gain understanding of a place unknown. I'm going to share with you some of the insights I gained. Often on Human Relations Day, we take time to remember Dr. Martin Luther King through his words and speeches. It seems to me that it's easier to focus on King's beautiful words than on the terror he and protesters endured at marches, boycotts, and behind jail walls. Today, let's look at the action behind the words. The sites I saw on the Civil Rights Trail deepened my understanding of these struggles for civil rights in our country. I'm going to share some of my photos of our visit to the Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. I did some background reading to prepare for our trip. The Children by David Halberstam was a commitment at over 700 pages. As I read, I realized how little I knew about the Children, the group of Black college students that found themselves as leaders in our civil rights movement. I was deeply touched by their stories, and they really came alive to me at the museum. What this experience taught me is that Black history is American history. And the story of these young people is not just about Dr. King's dream, it's about the American dream and our country's promise for equality. Here are some of the stories that touched me. Jim Lawson entered Oberlin College to earn a master's in religious studies in 1956. Lawson spent a year in prison for refusing to register for the draft for the Korean War. He could have deferred his draft because he was a student, but as a committed pacifist, he accepted the sentence to stay true to his beliefs. Upon his release from prison, he spent 3 years studying and teaching as a Methodist ministry in India, where he was drawn to Gandhi's teachings, and he adopted the nonviolent direct action strategy for protesting. Lawson began holding workshops on nonviolence with a small group of young Black college students. They trained on methods of nonviolence for months until they had no desire to strike back, and they held no hate in their hearts. The group included Diane Nash, Marion Barry, Bernard Lafayette, James Bevel, and John Lewis. You might recognize John Lewis as a current member of the U.S. House of Representatives. On February 13, 1960, 21-year-old Diane Nash, the group's leaders, felt nervous, like I do now, maybe more so. The next day, their small group would begin their sit-ins where they would insist on being serviced at lunch counters in downtown Nashville stores. The store owners welcomed their money, but they were not welcome at their lunch counters. Now they would take a seat and ask for service. The students continued their lunch counter sit-ins by refusing to give up their seats for months, accepting arrests with nonviolent principles. Finally, on May 10th, Black customers were served for the first time. In May 1961, Freedom Riders rode the interstate buses to protest segregated public places. This was very dangerous. Local law enforcement would leak the bus arrival information, so riders were greeted by angry mobs and Klansmen. Even after their bus was bombed in Alabama, the riders continued on. As a mother, I can only imagine how I would feel if I sent my student to college and instead of attending classes, they were endangering their lives by protesting. And the riders were willing to die for their beliefs. Many of the young riders did their best to hide their activities from their parents to spare them worry or embarrassment. The riders were routinely beaten and arrested. Behind bars, they sung their theme song, "We Shall Overcome." The jailers hated the singing and threatened to take their mattresses from them if the singing continued. You can guess what happened next. The Freedom Riders were a big step towards the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. In March of 1968, Jim Lawson, now a Methodist minister, asked Dr. King to come to Memphis to help with the sanitation workers' strike. The conflict started when 2 sanitation workers were crushed and killed in their truck when it malfunctioned. The workers had 3 demands: safety, better wages, and they no longer wanted to be referred to as boy. And so the strike became known as the I'm a Man campaign. Dr. King agreed to come to Memphis. Walter and Laurie Bailey owned the Lorraine Motel, one of the only few Black businesses in Memphis. The motel hosted all the Black entertainments of the day, and King was a regular visitor, usually staying in room 306. It was common knowledge that he stayed at the Lorraine Hotel. James Earl Ray was an escaped convict traveling around the country undetected. A racist, he became involved in the presidential campaign for George Wallace while he was in California. Ray's motives for killing Martin Luther King were never fully known, but after his time working to elect Wallace, he began moving around the country stalking Dr. King. On April 3, 1968, Ray checks into the boarding house across the street from the Lorraine Motel. When he spots King on the balcony, he proceeds to the bathroom down the hall with his rifle. He climbs in the bathtub, rests his barrel of the gun on the windowsill, and using a magnifier, takes one shot at Dr. King. While Martin Luther King fights for his life, James Earl Ray escapes. It takes over 3,000 FBI agents over 2 months to bring him to justice. It was the largest manhunt in U.S. history. In 1982, a local nonprofit group saved the site from foreclosure for use as America's first civil rights museum. I was surprised it took till 1982 to have a civil rights museum in our country, but this was the first one.
Mary Lou took most of those photos, too. And you can tell she'd been reading a book about James Earl Ray. In the end there, she knows an awful lot about that as well. 2 nights in Birmingham, the most populated city in Alabama, allowed us enough time to take much of the city's civil rights history in. But the flashpoint was Kelly Ingram Park and 16th Street Baptist Church, which lie next to one another in what's known as the Civil Rights District. In 1963, discriminatory practices were growing in Birmingham. Bull Connor, the racist public safety commissioner overseeing the police department, believed in segregation and turned a blind eye to Klan activity. Bombings became regular occurrence. Many blacks feared violence or the loss of their jobs if they participated in demonstrations. Reluctantly, King agreed to accept children as protesters. Not all the children's parents agreed to let them march, but despite this, they were feeling empowered and they marched anyway. Kelly Ingram Park was the staging area for the protest known as the Children's March. May 2nd, 1963, more than 1,000 students left school and marched downtown to the park. Bull Connor responded by jailing 600. The next day, 1,000 more students filled the park. With the jails already full, Bull Connor responded savagely. He ordered the fearless child crusaders to be blasted with high-pressure water cannons. Police officers used fierce dogs to control the crowd. Images of the confrontations were broadcast around the world and eventually resulted in the signing of the Civil Rights Act. This sculpture of 4 girls stands directly across the street from the 16th Street Baptist Church. On Sunday, September 15th, 1963, a bomb tore through the walls of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Sunday school had just ended, and the black congregation members were preparing for their Sunday service. They were unaware that members of the Ku Klux Klan had laid sticks of dynamite under the church's stairs. 4 little girls were killed: Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins, all 14 years old, and an 11-year-old Denise McNair. A portion of Dr. King's eulogy for the young victims of the 16th Street Baptist bombing went as follows. They have something to say to each of us in their death. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. We had just 24 hours in Montgomery. There was a lot to take in. The Rosa Parks Library and Museum, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, but the 2 newest sites were essential. So we spent most of our time at the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The Legacy Museum, which takes viewers on a powerful journey from enslavement to mass incarceration, did not allow photography, so you won't see any of the photos inside. But I strongly urge you to visit the museum or the Equal Justice Initiative website to learn more about that place. A few months before our visit, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened on 6 acres on a hill overlooking downtown Montgomery. This immense installation is dedicated to 4,000 African Americans who were lynched by white Americans for nearly 100 years following the Civil War. The roots of the Memorial for the Peace and Justice lie in similar commemorations, like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The conception of this memorial was credited to Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. The pavilion itself is a giant sculpture filled with 800 6-foot-tall rusted steel monuments, some standing upright, others suspended. Each is inscribed with the name of a state and a county within the state, along with the names of African Americans lynched in that county. As you walk through the pavilion, the floors begin to incline downward. Monuments are then presented in suspension, eventually so high that the inscribed names are unreadable, but something else appears on the wall below. epitaphs to men and women and children who were lynched in the country. These captions were painful to read, nearly impossible to imagine. Here's two examples. Jack Turner was lynched in Butler, Alabama in 1882 for organizing black voters in Choctaw County. And this one really gets me. Henry Patterson was lynched in LaBelle, Florida in 1926 for asking a white woman for a drink of water. At this point, our journey seemed to reach an apogee, a point at which you feel it can go no further, not sure you want to see anymore. But as you leave the memorial, you find duplicates of the steel monuments waiting to be claimed and installed in counties they represent. Over time, the National Memorial will serve as a report on which parts of the country have confronted this truth and this terror, and which ones have not. This is inside the installation. The quote reads along this wall, "Thousands of African Americans are unknown victims of racial terror, many of whose deaths cannot be documented, many whose names will never be known. They are all honored here." One more final suggestion on this monument. Look online and use the keywords Lester Holt and Peace and Justice, and you'll find a 4-minute segment with Lester and Brian Stevenson sharing their thoughts about the memorial. They're probably much more articulate than myself, but it's an interesting 4-minute segment. Finally, in Selma, on our way to our final destination in Jackson, Mississippi, we stopped briefly in Selma. Here's our view of the Edmund Pettus Bridge from the 3rd floor of the Selma Interpretive Center. While we roamed around buildings nearby, Mary Lou ventured close to the entrance of the bridge and took the background photo in this slide. And in the foreground, there's a black and white photo that's showing what's known as Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965. Even as marchers fought for the right to carry out the protest, President Johnson addressed Congress calling for voting rights legislation to protect African Americans from barriers that prevented them from voting. And now to our final destination in Jackson.
Our Civil Rights Trail vacation with Mark and Mary Lou ended in Jackson. They flew to Florida to visit with family, and the bicycling portion of our trip for Lesley and myself began. Lesley and I had a free Sunday morning, but this being Jackson, Mississippi in the Deep South, all of the museums were closed till 1 p.m. So we decided that we would go to church. We went to Galloway UMC. And as we approached Galloway, I noticed 3 things. First, Galloway is located on the square of the state capitol building. Second, Galloway is a large church building with these Greek revival architecture columns, just like the U.S. Supreme Court building. Third, there's a sign in front of this church that Lesley just passed there that says that Galloway was the first Christian congregation worshiping there in Jackson since 1839. It was clear that Galloway was at one point one of the seats of power in Jackson, Mississippi. So inside, the worship service was just like this one today in some ways. It was Methodist hymnals, it was same order of service, and the congregation was very friendly. It was about 95% white, although one of the 4 pastors was African American. We talked to a few of the people afterwards, and they were all very welcoming. It was both familiar and different a little. But the lesson, I think, is don't be afraid to walk in the front doors of that church someplace. So after we said our goodbyes, we took a quick walk around the Capitol building, past the large Gothic Baptist church, and over to the Civil Rights Museum. The museum told the history of Mississippi and Jackson in the civil rights era. And to give you a feel for what Mississippi and race relations were like then, look at this quote. It says, "If it is necessary, every Negro in the state will be lynched. It will be done to maintain white supremacy." Think about that. Digest that. Every Negro in the state will be lynched. It will be done to maintain white supremacy. While you think about that, I'd like to give you a little background on the United Methodist Church during this period. In 1939, 3 Methodist denominations returned and reunited to form what was then the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. But to make that union possible, the Methodist Protestant clergywomen had to give up their rights as clergy persons. And most notoriously, the Methodist Episcopal Church South required the creation of something called the central jurisdiction. This enshrined segregation and the attendant second-class citizenship into the Constitution of the Methodist Church. And it was not until 1968 that that segregation and the central jurisdiction were eliminated. I see a few of you nodding your heads. You remember this. Well, the museum had a number of points of light displays. These were displays about white people that stood up against racism in Mississippi. And one of those, as a lifelong Methodist, I took an interest in. It was one of Ed King, Reverend Ed King. He was a Jackson, Mississippi Methodist minister. There's a picture of him. In 1962, 28 Methodist ministers signed a document entitled Born of Conviction. The document makes the moral and biblical argument that it is their task as Christian ministers to speak from the pulpit against racial discrimination. In June of 1963, Medgar Evers, Ed King, and others organized pray-ins in Jackson. Black college students tried to worship in white churches and were turned away. First, they tried to enter the white First Baptist Church around the corner. They were turned away. Then they came to Galloway, UMC, and they were turned away there by the ushers. And the ushers had the very unfortunate name of being called the color guard. Yes. I saw afterwards a video, an oral history of one of the pastors, and he said, yes, at that time we called the ushers the color guard to keep the colored people out. In protest later that day, the senior pastor, Dr. W.B. Soleil, resigned in protest. He was another point of light in this museum. There he is. 2 years earlier, Dr. Soleil wrote this. He said, "Let me nail down the Christian principle. There can be no color bar in the Christian church. It is not sinful for white people to prefer to worship with white people, or for colored people to prefer to worship with colored people. The sin comes when the church seeks to erect a color bar before the cross of Christ." So, were the Methodists the good guys? Or were they the bad guys? After the 28 ministers wrote their Born of Conviction document, some were immediately removed from their churches. Some ministers had crosses burned on their lawns and received telephone calls threatening themselves, their children, and their wives. More than half of the 28 ministers had left the state after 2 years. They were vilified in the Mississippi press. And what do you think their boss, Marvin Franklin, the bishop, had to say? Well, he said, "Integration is not to be forced on any part of our church. Move on to do the work of the church, loving mercy, doing justly, and walking humbly with our Lord. In other words, their boss, the bishop, was telling the Mississippi ministers, stay out of integration and get back to work. One of the other interesting stories from our trip about Methodists was in Birmingham. Mark talked about Bull Connor. He was the public safety commissioner from the 30s, 5 decades, all the way up to the 60s. But in Birmingham, who was the power in Birmingham? Was it Bull Connor? He had the authority of his office, but who was the power that kept Birmingham under the thumb of Bull Connor? According to our tour guide, it was the Methodists. They were the business people. They were the people that said, we want Bull Connor running our city. I know there are many other Methodists, white and black, with central roles and ancillary roles during the civil rights era, and I hope someday to learn their stories on another trip. But my earlier question about good guys and bad guys, I think, is too simplistic. It's too simplistic for looking back at this period of time. It's too simplistic for looking forward. Ed King explained things this way. He said, we are moving towards being one church. But in America, we are still very separate as black and white people. But we are moving, we are on our way. In the history that people are recording here of people who wrestled with their conscience and decided eventually that Galloway should be open, it is a Christian church. I think that seems right. People wrestled with their conscience then, and people wrestle with their conscience today.
As we have heard, we had the opportunity to visit some powerful and sobering places on our trip. When you are in the community, when you walk the streets, when you see the buildings, when you visit the churches and homes, and when you talk to the people who live there, you begin to get a much clearer sense of the struggle, hardship, and terror suffered by African Americans in our country. While visiting the Legacy Museum, also referred to as the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, I happened upon 3 elderly African American women who had toured the museum and were sitting in a quiet space talking. One woman just kept shaking her head, saying, I never thought I would see anything like this in my lifetime. It was a powerful moment for me to bear witness to a moment that was not meant for my ears. While it may seem like our country has made great strides towards justice and equality for all people, there is still work to be done. Did you know that the Constitution of Alabama still calls for school segregation? The voters have had the opportunity to eliminate this language, but the referendums have failed, most recently in 2012. The Confederate flag was not an unusual sighting. Glorification of the Confederacy is part of the Southern culture. It is exhibited through monuments, local stories, and events. We visited the cemetery in Selma and saw this monument of Nathan Bedford Forrest. In addition to being a famous Confederate lieutenant general, he was also the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. The monument was moved to this place from downtown Selma in 2001 by the City Council. The city of Natchez, Mississippi, holds an annual pilgrimage each year when people come from all over to tour the large, majestic Natchez antebellum homes. They've been preserved by local groups there. Part of the citywide event is a formal ball where a king and queen are crowned. The king wears a Confederate officer's uniform, and the queen wears a Southern belle gown. I understand the desire to maintain traditions and acknowledge history, but at some point we have to ask ourselves, how we can move forward if we hold fast to traditions that are steeped in a history of oppression of others. Isn't our ability to reconcile with each other inhibited by how tightly we hold on to these parts of our past? I do want to say that all the people we met and spoke with were friendly, hospitable, generous, and kind, and even somewhat curious. One African-American woman in Clarksdale, Mississippi, was very inquisitive about the fact that Ken and I were together. Were we married? How long were we married? Did we have kids? How many? We were happy to answer all of her questions and share a bit about ourselves.
The civil rights period was significant and historic, but primarily about events 40 to 50 years ago. Lesley and I were telling our son Jacob, who is here, about our talk, and he strongly encouraged us to talk about events today. During the children's moment, I showed this t-shirt. It says the march continues, but I asked the question, does it? I was thinking about that, and I think the answer is yes. And a surprisingly significant amount of tangible progress has actually been made recently. Remember this t-shirt? The Equal Justice Initiative is committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States. And in December, President Trump signed the First Step Act, a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill, into law. Remember this t-shirt? Why I Vote? Voting rights is a primary initiative of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they worked hard mobilizing voters, and last November, Florida voters passed an initiative restoring voting rights to 1.5 million people with felony convictions. And closer to home, in December, Lesley and I attended a county board of supervisors meeting. The board was hearing comments about whether or not to have an inspector general to provide oversight for our sheriff. I heard from people who backed the sheriff and people from Black Lives Matter who were frustrated and angry and expressed that frustration and anger. I heard from people giving their comments from many, many points of view. I wanted to talk, but I did not sign up early enough, unfortunately. But after 4 hours of taking comments, I realized that the conversation is happening. Our leaders are listening, and they're trying to be responsive. And even more close to home and more immediate. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day, and Lesley and I are going to go to an MLK Day Rotary Club fundraiser, but for everyone here, I'd encourage you to please consider joining Mark and Mary Lou and others who will be marching tomorrow in the March for the Dream. It starts at 8 a.m. at Oak Park Community Center or 9 a.m. at Sac City College and lasts till about 12 or 1 o'clock. You are also invited to join into the Centennial Social Justice Reading Group, which is on 7 p.m. on January 30th. They read different books on social justice issues. So if you believe that there is more to be done, if you believe that social justice is a march that started with Jesus and needs to continue, then the march surely will continue. Thank you.